Kalorama, a recorded books hybrid imprint, presents Underserved, Harnessing the Principles of Lincoln's Vision for Reconstruction for Today's Forgotten Communities, by Jerron Smith and Chris Pilkerton, read by Bill Andrew Quinn. Forward. In the summer of 2020, shortly after the death of George Floyd, we released the Contract with Black America, CWBA. The CWBA is designed to address many aspects of society that need urgent attention regarding both current and historic treatment of the Black community. Its wide dissemination garnered lots of attention, much of it from political circles. Surprising to us, we found politicians from both sides of the aisle receptive. Willing to speak truth to power, we engaged with anyone who could help us address the nonpartisan issue of improving the Black condition, especially when it came to economic opportunity and closing the absurd 12-to-1 wealth gap between Black and white families. Jerron and Chris had worked on the passage and implementation of the First Step Act and were also part of the White House team putting together an economic plan for Black America. They reached out to us as part of their efforts. Unlike others who paid us the usual lip service, this team was willing to discuss and debate the issues in detail and to integrate many of our ideas into their proposals. We obviously didn't agree on everything. Anyone who says they do either doesn't think for themselves or is probably lying, but we held their feet to the fire, especially when it came to establishing a concrete commitment of $500 billion to directly benefit Black-owned businesses. Chris, Jerron, and the rest of the administration didn't ask for anything in return. No campaigning, no commercials, no endorsement. It was about advancing a solution to a problem we all agreed needed to be solved. Due to the results of that election, that plan was never able to be implemented. But we continued to work on the CWBA, and Jerron and Chris worked with us, even though neither was still in the government. So far, our work has resulted in the National Football League giving over $150 million in contracts to Black-owned companies, and we continue to work with other Fortune 500 companies and other Black-owned small businesses to ensure that more opportunities in the corporate supply chain get filled. We don't agree with either party all the time. What we do agree with is helping Black America, which has for so long been overlooked and taken for granted. As such, anyone willing to put in the work and not just talk the talk has our respect and attention. This book is about failures and successes. It describes a pathway for many communities to rise, even after decades of letdown and disappointment. The people in Washington call working together bipartisanship, but this issue about helping underserved communities is simple humanity. We hope people listen to this book because it lays out ideas for us to work together on these issues, even if they disagree with some of it, because at least it starts the conversation. Standing far apart and screaming at each other hasn't resulted in solutions for people who need it most. Only by opening our minds and having good faith, spirited discussions, and even disagreements, we can arrive at a place of action. Politics is always going to be part of the equation. But if we start from a place where we recognize that everyone needs access to opportunities, we can accomplish more than we ever imagined. Ice Cube and Jeffrey Quatinetz. Preface. Almost 100 years before the Civil War, Founding Father Benjamin Franklin, who would later petition Congress to abolish slavery, traveled from the United States to England. Footnote. In 1789, he wrote and published several essays supporting the abolition of slavery, and his last public act was to send to Congress a petition on behalf of the society asking for the abolition of slavery and an end to the slave trade. The petition, signed on February 3, 1790, asked the first Congress, then meeting in New York City, to devise means for removing the inconsistency from the character of the American people, and to promote mercy and justice toward this distressed race. End of footnote. While approaching the shoreline, his vessel came under great stress and danger from the rocky shoals and dramatic currents. While Franklin made it safely to ground, he wrote to his wife about this incident during his voyage, stating, "Were I Roman Catholic, Perhaps I should on this occasion vow to build a chapel to some saint, but as I am not, if I were to vow at all, it should be to build a lighthouse. It is with this intention that this book has been written. This country has seen, and in many respects continues to see, very turbulent times. And regardless of race or religion, this country needs a path forward that must be walked by our people and our leaders together. However, that path must be illuminated by the lighthouse of intentionality, a concept that the listener will be very familiar with by the end of this book. This work seeks to add a few bricks to the construction of that lighthouse so that our collective journey will result in safe and sustainable passage. When Jaron was growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, everything he knew about political history originated from the perspective that conservative Republicans wanted to oppress black people. He believed it was actually the Democrats, both liberal and progressive, who were the champions of social advancement and were those seeking to address the issues of racism and poverty. However, Jaron was not aware of the nuances of what it meant to be conservative or liberal, and he certainly was not aware of the foundations of either ideology. His introduction to society started in ways that may be familiar to many black Americans. He clearly recalls the first time he was called a nigger. It was 1992, and he was 11 years old living with no heat or lights because his family's bills had gone unpaid. He was a self-described angry young man, as he had determined that others might view him as something less than who he truly was. This belief was coupled with the fear that he might never get the chance to prove to them that he was anything different. Somehow, however, he knew that this apparent reality would not define him, and more importantly, he sought to make it his life's mission that others in similar circumstances who were unable to advocate for change would not be characterized by those conditions. But how would such a young man actually do that? Role models like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and so many other civil rights leaders preached about nonviolent protest, but at the same time, leaders like Malcolm X advised more active resistance. It was a lot for any black person to digest, but perhaps especially so for a young black man in this urban environment. Jaron's father focused on the basic building blocks of education so that Jaron could make decisions about how to establish his own path, which was much more difficult than it seemed. His neighborhood was full of violence, and those that were making their way in the world seemed to be the toughest people on the block. This translated into his initial worldview that physical dominance was a critical component of any kind of advancement. While Jaron didn't engage in the gang activities, he still needed an outlet for what he was building up inside him. High school football became that outlet, but also provided him with much-needed discipline and experience in goal setting. As with so many others both inside and outside of underserved communities, sports became a genuine avenue of teaching and training for him, and a perfect way to see hard work translate into success. An injury cut that on-field experience short, but the lessons remained. Trying to determine how to advance without his physical strength, Jaron turned to his father's instruction and focused on his education. While certainly not a stellar student prior to his football injury, Jaron redoubled his efforts. He went from potentially being expelled from school for both behavioral and academic reasons to becoming a strong student leader. While the temptations of gangs and criminal activity were always present, he knew that he must not consider that avenue. He knew that his approach to life must include an examination of the underlying reasons for socio-economic circumstances, and that he must find those out on his own. Jaron did not really start out as a liberal or a conservative. As mentioned, he didn't even really know what those terms meant. But as he discovered things for himself, he saw that many of the people helping him along his journey, his teachers and coaches, for example, were in fact conservatives. Reading authors like Ralph Waldo Emerson, he established the foundational principles for what his core philosophy would become: a concentration on self-reliance. His critical thinking skills developed, and he taught himself to see through circumstances and to not blindly accept one side's politics over the other. This ability became stronger every day as he continued to see what was happening in this community, as drugs and alcohol addiction perpetuated a vicious cycle of poverty and prison for so many in his neighborhood. As he discovered other authors, like Rudyard Kipling, who espoused being the master of one's fate, he knew that it would be up to him to decide how to approach solutions to the problems he was seeing and dealing with firsthand. Geron's struggles speak to the challenges of so many Black Americans, as well as so many others in underserved communities. Hurdles in the form of a lack of role models, education, training, capital, or what have you, are omnipresent. There are, of course, significant historic components to these challenges, and many of them have become systemic across many communities. Crime, violence, and the associated traumas are not so easy to shake off. They live with a person and can easily cause their personal downfall. Chris's experience was different. Growing up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., he was not exposed to daily violence or crime. His parents provided a very comfortable upbringing, but also stressed the importance of education and the concept of service to others. Chris wound up at his father's alma mater, Gonzaga College High School, a Jesuit institution just blocks from the U.S. Capitol building. For those of you who do not know the Jesuits, it is a group within the Roman Catholic Church technically called the Society of Jesus. Footnote. It is important to be clear that while the Jesuits have undoubtedly impacted many individuals in order to advance social justice efforts, the organization did have historical engagement in the slave trade. Adam Rothman, a historian at Georgetown University, has stated that the idea was that the Jesuit plantations manned by enslaved people would essentially subsidize the Jesuit educational mission. It should be further noted that Georgetown University has publicly acknowledged this history. In 2015, Georgetown University President John DeGioia established the Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation. The working group's efforts led to a formal apology from the Jesuits and the creation of the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation, announced in 2021 as a partnership formed by the Jesuits and the GU272 Descendants Association. The Jesuit order pledged to raise $100 million for the foundation's work, which will support educational opportunities and scholarships from early childhood education to higher education for descendants of the 272 enslaved men, women, and children. End of footnote. Its founder, St. Ignatius Loyola, established a vision of seeing God in all things and seeking a commitment to service and justice. Loyola was the son of a nobleman, and during his military service he had a significant injury that left him bedridden, with only biographies of saints to read. This in part led to the founding of the order and its focus on education. The Jesuits have the tongue-in-cheek nickname of God's Marines, as their approach to ministry and education incorporates global outreach. In fact, Loyola often ended his letters to his fellow Jesuits with Ite inflammate omnia, go set the world on fire. This phrase reflected his desire for his colleagues to educate in a manner that showed God's passion and zeal for humanity. Chris found this approach to education very compelling, and it associated all learning with how one could use the knowledge gained to help people. Much like Geron, education became the tool for Chris that would light the pathway to helping others. This idea became even more entrenched in him as he became engaged in the many social outreach programs at Gonzaga, such as the famed Father McKenna Center on campus, which so many Gonzaga students participated in to feed the homeless of Washington. Chris went on to a Jesuit college, Fairfield University. There he utilized his favorite subject, politics, as an educational foundation to effect change. He was among the first students to run for local town council and the first to contemporaneously serve as both a town council member and the student body president. He used this combination of roles to address campus issues of race relations as well as to foster student service within the larger community. He would also be fortunate to engage on mission trips to work directly with the poor as part of his experience at Fairfield. Once again, much like Geron, He knew that a calling was wrapped up somewhere in all of this, and while he does not describe himself as a patient person, he is very aware that things like this all happen in God's time. While not attributable to the Jesuits per se, a meaningful adage in considering these journeys is, "I'm not interested in whether you've stood with the great. I'm interested in whether you've sat with the broken." Chris recalls one particularly impactful Jesuit professor who taught a first-year religion class at Fairfield, where students studied books across the religious and social spectra. The professor required two things from the students in addition to completing the assignments. First, if they didn't understand a word or a concept during a lecture, they were required to say, "Stop." If someone did not stop the professor within 5 seconds of his uttering an intentionally difficult word or concept, he would require a class-wide pop quiz, the result of which would either add or subtract a full point off each student's final grade. For whatever reason, the student's youth, shyness, or embarrassment, a few pop quizzes took place in the wake of no one stopping the professor. But after they dropped a few grade points before even taking a real test, people stopped him pretty frequently, and everyone learned together. Second, while reading a book, whether it was the Bible, the biography of Malcolm X, the speeches of Martin Luther King, or the works of another author, a student would have to ask the professor a question as if they were the author. In other words, forcing the students to put themselves in the place of the individual whose writings they were asking about. These two approaches to learning not only became cornerstones to Chris's approach to critical thinking, but helped to establish that putting oneself in the place of others and truly empathizing with them is crucial to any holistic policy approach. 25 years later, after almost 3 years serving as general counsel and then acting administrator at the U.S. Small Business Administration, in late 2019, Chris was asked to come to the White House to meet with Jared Kushner, then senior advisor to President Donald Trump. The meeting was brief, and Brooke Rollins, the head of the Office of American Innovation and future head of the Domestic Policy Council, was also present. Chris had previously met them both briefly in presidential cabinet meetings, but he had not spent much time with either of them. They welcomed him into Jared's office, they all sat down, and Chris was asked the question that any student of public policy might be a little intimidated to hear just steps from the Oval Office. What do you want to do next? Chris knew instantly that this covered the gamut of the entire federal government, so the next words out of his mouth would be important. Having been a financial crimes prosecutor and securities regulatory attorney for much of his earlier career, he first thought that the Department of Treasury would be a reasonable destination. But then, relying on his Jesuit roots, Chris went to a problem that had been vexing our society for far too long, and one that he had been exposed to early in this journey. So he answered, homelessness. They discussed a general approach to address the issue of national homelessness, and then Chris left the White House campus, still blown away and filled with a unique sense of patriotism. Shortly after, Brooke called Chris, asking if he would lead the White House's Opportunity Now program. It would be an all-of-government approach to address all issues for underserved communities, including economic development and poverty, certainly a larger portfolio that had been discussed in their first meeting. As will be discussed throughout this book, that role at the White House developed almost contemporaneously with the COVID pandemic. But that meeting and those people would directly impact Chris and his family a short time later. In June of 2020, after Chris had been working at the White House for just a few months, his older brother took his own life, a casualty of sorts of the pandemic. In the midst of his and his family's grief at the funeral, Chris looked up to see Jared, Brooke, Jaron, and his White House colleagues Steve Smith and Charlton Boyd, as well as the accompanying security detail. They had surreptitiously gone to the funeral to support their friend and colleague. That night, after all of the funeral attendees were gone, Chris sat with his young nephew at the kitchen table. The boy asked his Uncle Chris if he had seen the Secret Service members that had been there for his papa's funeral. He took their presence as a sign of respect for his father, and frankly it was, as it was his papa who had imparted so much of his time, energy, and wisdom to Chris, resulting in his working with these folks in the first place. Chris will never be able to express how much their presence meant to him on the darkest day of his life, nor will he be able to adequately convey their contribution to his nephew's perception of that awful time. The very next day at 8 a.m., Chris met with Jared in his office in the West Wing and was given the green light to initiate a draft presidential executive order on mental illness and suicide. Tragedies that plague so many families in 2020 and still do. The executive order, entitled Saving Lives Through Increased Support for Mental and Behavioral Health Needs, was signed by President Trump on October 5, 2020. So, given their different backgrounds and upbringings, are Jaron and Chris an unlikely pair to co-author this book? Perhaps, but it is their collective experiences that allow them to take on the issues discussed within this book. It is their singular commitment that not only fuels a vision for our country's underserved communities, but does so in a way that underscores that immediate actions can lead to transformational results. People will not have to hope and wait for opportunity if our society decides to follow a plan that re-examines civil society and rediscovers what it means to be an American. Chapter 1. Defining the Problem. It was February 7, 2020 in Charlotte, North Carolina. A national policy summit initiated by the Trump White House titled Opportunity Now had been scheduled to take place at Central Piedmont Community College. This was supposed to be the first of dozens of meetings that would usher in a new era of public and private partnerships all across America. For the first time in history, all of the key federal and state agencies with resources for underserved communities would provide aligned direct technical assistance to local residents on a number of programs focusing on areas including economic development, entrepreneurship, workforce, and housing. The event featured local, state, and national private and public sector leaders discussing a number of topics, and the goal was to engender a shared strategy for empowering the underserved in Charlotte and throughout North Carolina, which would then become a blueprint for the entire country. This event was only a first step toward moving these communities forward, and it was positioned to set an example to be applied in other states and cities. Then, just a month later, when the organizers were in the midst of preparing the same opportunity for Miami, the whole world changed as we all fell victim to the coronavirus. The strategy was forced to change, but the mission endured. The title of this book, Underserved, refers to all of the forgotten communities across this country. The goal of helping these communities was meant to be addressed during the Reconstruction phase of history at the close of the Civil War. While this somewhat utopian idea of President Abraham Lincoln's did not have nearly the successes that were envisioned, its legacy, both the good and bad elements of it, remains deeply entrenched in the United States. Over 150 years later, politicians continue to give lip service to these socio-economic realities, but the fact of the matter is that deep disparities continue to exist. The Opportunity Now Summit in Charlotte was supposed to be the first example of an international strategy to change the trajectory for underserved communities, but beneath the COVID pandemic and the results of the 2020 election, time simply ran out. And given the strategy's inability to be consistent and intentional, the stark differences in economic opportunity across our country continue. It is just a fact that these disparities exist. A fact that certainly will not change with campaign speeches and nonspecific, never-ending government programs. The simple question that stands before the country is, what is the plan for these disenfranchised communities? And the question for the conservative movement is, how do we address it in a meaningful way that is consistent with conservative principles? The answers to both questions have unquestioned human consequences, as well as significant political realities. Republicans sometimes use certain cliches when referring to their party, such as the Party of Lincoln or a Big Tent Party, but without a specific strategy that outlines how these communities can be materially assisted, one that is consistent with traditional conservative ideology. Clichés such as these will be deemed hollow by the national electorate. To introduce the relationship of the authors a bit more, Chris and Geron first met while working in the Trump administration. Their paths crossed because of their shared focus on creating solutions to the issues that plague underserved communities. Issues like access to capital, lack of jobs and opportunity, economic dynamism, and lack of public safety. At the same time, Chris was serving as general counsel at the U.S. Small Business Administration, SBA, and Geron was serving as the Special Assistant to the President for Legislative Affairs and Director of White House Urban Affairs. A typical presidential administration establishes something known as a Presidential Coordinating Committee, or a PCC, which does much of the work after the announcement of a presidential executive order. In these meetings, all relevant cabinet agencies are represented, typically by deputy secretaries or other senior policy officials within their agencies, but rarely, if ever, by general counsels. The PCC on which Chris and Geron met had been formed as part of the executive order establishing the White House Opportunity Revitalization Council, WHORC, and the day they met, it was being led by Geron as the Director of Urban Affairs. This PCC announcement came across Chris's desk not as an invitation, but rather as a simple agency notice. Given his interest in the topic, Chris joined the assigned SBA representative in the treaty room of the old executive office building of the White House campus. There he first heard about Geron's vision for supporting underserved communities and about the impact that all of the agencies around the table could have to advance this mission. It was not yet a full plan, but rather a promise that would help shape the thinking set forth in this book. That moment in time has passed, and much of Geron's original vision was transformed by the impact of the pandemic. But now, without the power of the White House and the command of the specific executive agencies, conservatives must regroup and determine where this issue falls in terms of priority and how they, as members of a party and a community, can determine a dedicated way forward. One critical notion here is that the necessary strategy for underserved communities must be crafted by principled conservatives who have seen the process from the inside of government. Chris and Geron have worked at the highest levels of a presidential administration, one serving as a cabinet member, one counseling the vice president, and both advising the President of the United States, governors, and mayors on critical issues of economic development all across the country during one of the most consequential times in the history of our republic. Geron has worked for some of the most notable politicians in the current conservative movement, including Vice President Mike Pence, Senator Tim Scott, and Representatives Jim Jordan and J.C. Watts. While serving in the White House, he developed groundbreaking legislation that has been deemed critical to underserved communities. This legislation concentrated on topics such as opportunity zones, permanent funding for historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, and the First Step Act's criminal justice reform, which in part focused on the rehabilitation and reentry of prisoners into our communities, as well as the WHORC, which was publicly launched at the Opportunity Now Summit in Charlotte. During this time, Chris served at the SBA. Even before the implementation of the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, to support businesses and their workforces during the pandemic, he committed certain agency efforts to outreach and access to capital, workforce development, and technical assistance programs for underserved communities, as well as his spearheading of a first-of-its-kind series of conferences to enhance employment opportunities for the disabled, foster youth aging out of the system, and the formerly incarcerated. He had the good fortune of working with Linda McMahon during her tenure as SBA administrator, and his time succeeding her in that role allowed him to continue the many impactful policy initiatives that she had championed, including significant cross-collaboration with key agency partners, such as the Departments of Education and Labor. In March 2020, Chris and Geron teamed up at the White House. At the time, Jaron was serving as the Deputy Director of the Office of American Innovation, while Chris had been appointed to run the formal National Opportunity Now program.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?